Hi everyone, just wanted to do a quick summary for last week. I wanted to touch on the discussion first. Good work in the discussion. You guys are great at that, so you don't usually need much guidance from me. But did want to. I had touched on this in there a little bit, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the expansion versus non-expansion states for Medicaid. So generally, in my impression, my perception of the states that have chosen not to expand, mainly due to finance. So I think states that have chosen not to expand saw that kind of the writing on the wall for what's happening now. The 2018 when the original realm of finance, those expansion recipients were covered at 100% through federal funding. Now we've reached the point where they're covered at 90% through federal funding. So states have to pick up 10%. And right now that's in perpetuity. But who's to say at some point there's not a federal order, executive order that changes that, or maybe a change in the law that changes that, that says, oh, well, all of the Medicaid recipients across the board move to the regular funding scheme, which is 50-50 federal state funding. Or maybe there's something that says, no, sorry, the Medicaid expansion is done away with. So if you choose to keep up those expanded criteria, states fund that in full. So I think that folks that are in those state government positions were just being fiscally responsible and saying, no, we don't have the funding. Some states may have had funding opportunities. Some states had tax increases to deal with that this year. But so it's some states just didn't have funding availability for those areas. But there are definitely some states that did not move forward with the the expansion that are now going through reforms in their Medicaid programs to hopefully bring some more funding to their program and maybe be able to help some more people in the future. I think that that's the key. That they really, actually, there's not a state in the union that doesn't need to reform their Medicaid system. They're all pretty much a mess, and they really do need to reform. They need cost control. They need fraud and abuse controls. They're all, they all need some help. So hopefully this can help. This can drive states to move forward and reform some of those systems. Also, I hope that you enjoyed the assignment working on the request for information. I think I just want to give you a taste of what that legislative process is like. I had mentioned it in last week's summary, but what really, anytime that there is a request for information like that or a proposed rule, so if there's a new rule that's being put out by a regulatory agency, the agencies that we deal with most in healthcare are going to be Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services or Department of Health and Human Services. Or if you're working in in the broader context of healthcare, you may deal with the FDA, you may deal with NIH, you may deal with any of these types of organizations, and they'll put out a proposed rule where we can read through and then provide commentary in that same way on that same site. Or you can read the proposed rule in the Federal Register and then provide written commentary back to them in a similar manner, usually via an email address. So it's really important to understand that process, and that's how regulations kind of become law. They're not really law, but they're treated like law in a court of law. So if perhaps there's a regulation, like for example HIPAA is a great example. So the HIPAA privacy regulations or the HIPAA security regulations, they're regulations. HIPAA itself, the bigger context, was a law that was passed back in '96. But the things that tell us what we have to do to protect privacy and security of protected health information, those are regulations. Those were written in the same way that RFI that you looked at was written. There was a regulation written in proposed format. People had time to comment, and then they wrote a final rule that then became ultimately kind of like a law, but it's a regulation. So that's how that process works. That's how agencies like CMS or Office of Civil Rights, these divisions of government agencies can become legislators ultimately, because they write these regulations secondary to law. Really interesting process, and something we can really take part in as a citizen, as an employee of a healthcare agency. Anyone has the ability to comment. So really cool process, something, if you have interest in that, I'd encourage you to be involved in that process. Our work in the textbook this week was about courts. So I'd encourage you, in the discussions, in our assignments for the week, I'm trying to keep that a little more topical, kind of things that are happening now, or things that are related to the articles and whatnot that I post. Our quiz and our reading is really more background information. So this week we looked at courts and that kind of governmental piece. So we looked at the court system and how that whole constitutional law, constitutional piece fits into our, I'm not going to say lawmaking process, because it's not as much the lawmaking process, but how the judicial branch fits into what we're doing. And you'll find that throughout our course. Although the textbook is, well, to me it's fascinating because that's my that's my area of interest. It can be a little dry, but it's really important that you understand that, kind of that civics aspect of what it is that we do. But there are some really interesting cases in there as well that really have kind of established case law in some interesting ways. So it's important that that we do pay close attention to the info that's in our text as well. So a few questions that I wanted to go over. The first one is, in a recent Supreme Court case pertaining to the Affordable Care Act, which was National Federation of Businesses, Independent Businesses versus Sebelius, the court ruled that, I won't read through all the answers, but the correct answer was the individual mandate was constitutional by considering it a tax. And so this had to do with the ACA, obviously, and the case that deemed that the individual mandate, which has since been done away with. Obviously, it's still in place for this year, but in 2019, at least right now, in 2019, that will go away. But this was when they took it to the Supreme Court. It went as high as the Supreme Court, and the reason that it was okay for in this case, the Supreme Court felt that the individual mandate was okay under the Constitution because the government has the ability to tax us. As a governmental agency under the Constitution, we can be taxed, and it was felt that that penalty was a tax. So it was appropriate that by applying that penalty to folks that chose not to pick up health insurance, it was considered a tax, and therefore it was appropriate under the Constitution. So our correct answer in this case was that the individual mandate was constitutional. It was appropriate because it was considered a tax. Our second question, decisions that affect the cost and quality of and access to healthcare are, and the correct answer was often decentralized and privatized. So the other answers had to do with it being monitored by and decisions made by the court, or on decisions under law, under legal circumstances. So really what the heart of this question is, are decisions about cost, quality, access made by the courts? Or are they legal in nature? And generally, they're not. Generally, these types of things like quality, cost, these are all very private functions, privatized functions, and made by all kinds of agencies. And you think back to, trying to think of what courses you guys have taken. I'm not sure if you've taken the quality course yet, but you think back to, if you have taken that class, or just even what you might know about quality in healthcare. a lot of quality improvement activities, or maybe perhaps quality items that you've learned throughout the program, are really driven by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, IHI. So that's a private agency. When we think about how we improve healthcare in our own organizations, a lot of healthcare improvement activities and quality activities are driven by internal activities. Things that are really driven by, say, the Joint Commission, which is a private agency that we use for accreditation. It's not a governmental agency. Now, the one thing that really has started to push this more toward it being a more governmental piece was the ACA. So the ACA put in place some quality measures through Medicare, really. So the Medicare program, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, within Medicare, they started to do what they call value-based purchasing, which really built, especially in the hospital setting and then also in the physician practice setting, started to build quality measures. And providers had to submit data on how they were dealing with quality in these different settings. Now, it really wasn't a quality program. It wasn't forcing providers to provide quality care, but it was forcing providers to submit data. So as I've said all along since these programs started, data doesn't equal quality, it just equals data. Garbage in, garbage out. If you're providing garbage data, you're probably providing garbage care, but hopefully it will ultimately make these providers that perhaps are not providing the highest level of care provide a higher level of care, knowing that they're being monitored. But generally, from a quality of care standpoint and from an access standpoint, the ACA is also kind of making strides there with expanding Medicaid, et cetera. So, but in the past, it's really just been a very privatized, decentralized function. We decide how we do quality. We decide when we open practices and open hospitals. It's been very decentralized and privatized. Okay, last question. Which of the following is not one of the 3 core roles of courts in the United States? So the correct answer here is writing new laws in cases where disputed laws have been deemed unconstitutional. So courts are not tasked with writing legislation. That's not one of their roles. Generally, there's 3 roles that courts have. They serve as a constitutional referee, so they're tasked with making sure the government is acting appropriately within the scope that the Constitution has given them. They are a meaning giver, meaning that they are clarifying the meanings of laws, because as we all know, if we've ever had a situation where perhaps we've been tasked with interpreting a law, or maybe we ourselves are like, maybe there's a little gray area, like if you're driving 57 in a 55 or 70 in a 55, maybe there's a little gray area with this law. That's what they are the meaning giver. So they are really clarifying the meaning of this law. What was meant by the legislators that created this law? And then they're also the rights protector. So they are the people that are tasked with making sure that we as citizens, if our rights have been violated in some way by a government agency, by law enforcement, by another citizen, they are there to protect us and make sure that anyone's rights, if they have been violated, they are there to protect them. But they are not there to write new laws. Only legislators can write laws, or like I had mentioned before, if a law then requires regulation, then regulations can kind of serve as a law as well. But generally, when you need a new law, that needs to be written by the legislative branch of the government. So that is the answer in that case. So I have blathered on enough in my what was to be a short summary, but I did want to clarify a few of those areas. If you have any questions on anything else, please just let me know. I'm happy to answer them. I know there were the questions come from a pool, so everyone gets different questions. So I tried to focus on the ones that folks got wrong generally. But if there are some other questions you have question about, please let me know. And otherwise, I will see everyone on the discussion board this week. Thanks so much.